me laying lots of land under starry skies. Don't fence me in, let me ride through.
Wat het oog is voor de minnaar, is voor de patriot de taal. Want in de nationale taal, zegt Benedict Anderson, verbeelden we ons de gemeenschap waar we bij horen. De gemeenschap, de natie, die er altijd al is geweest en die ons een gevoel van verbondenheid geeft met mensen die we nooit allemaal zullen ontmoeten, maar van wie we weten dat ze er zijn. Het zijn onze lotgenoten, onze taalgenoten, die dezelfde geschiedenis delen, dezelfde mythen geloven, dezelfde gewoonten hebben en dezelfde kranten lezen. Met deze benadering van nationalisme betrapt Benedict Anderson een terrein dat door andere wetenschappers angstvallig werd vermeden. Nationalisme was toch iets griezeligs. Het zette aan tot moord en doodslag, tot racisme en anti-Semitisme. Nee, zegt Benedict Anderson, nationalisme is precies wat het Nederlandse woord aangeeft. Vaderlandsliefde. Een liefde voor de plek waar je geboren bent, waar je je thuis voelt, waar je instinctief kunt communiceren in je moedertaal. Een liefde voor de symbolen die aan die plek een speciale waarde geven. De vlag, het volkslied, de feestelijke herdenkingen. Deze liefde kan lange tijd worden verwaarloosd en zelfs belachelijk lijken, tot het moment waarop het vaderland wordt bedreigd, vernederd of onderdrukt. Want dan blijkt die liefde vaak zo hevig te zijn dat we bereid zijn ervoor te sterven. Benedict Anderson is Zuidoost-Azië-specialist aan de Cornell University in New York. En hij behoort tot de 4 of 5 denkers in de wereld die werkelijk iets te zeggen heeft over zulke algemene onderwerpen als natievorming en nationalisme. Zijn boek Imagined Communities werd in vele talen vertaald en zelfs verfilmd. Het is het soort boek waarvan je de belangrijke passages niet kunt onderstrepen, omdat je anders het hele boek zou volkladden. Zelf zegt hij erover dat het misschien eigenaardig is dat het boek geschreven werd door iemand die geboren is in China, opgegroeid is in 3 verschillende landen, spreekt met een verouderd Engels accent, een Iers paspoort bezit en in Amerika woont en van daaruit de cultuur van Indonesië en Thailand bestudeert. Deze en andere eigenaardigheden over taal en nationalisme zullen het onderwerp zijn van ons gesprek. Mr. Anderson, welcome.
Thank you.
I just quoted your words about you being born in China, raised in 3 countries, carrying an Irish passport, living in America and devoted to Southeast Asia. So, why are you so interested in nationalism? Does it have something to do with your Irish background?
Yes, I come from a long line, actually, of nationalists in Ireland, but my mother's English, and very English. So it's I feel myself to be a kind of, to put it in a joking way, a kind of Eurasian, a person with mixed blood or mixed descent. And this always makes one uneasy. One always wants to feel 100% at home. And for a long time I didn't feel at home anywhere. Now I've decided that I can feel at home in 5 places.
But you hold on to your Irish passport. Why do you do that? I mean, it's not the easiest document to travel with.
No, actually it's very easy. It gets me all around Europe without any trouble. And I have a green card in America, so I can actually travel extremely easily, no problem at all.
And naturalization, you said that naturalization is such a beautiful word, but you wouldn't become a naturalized American?
Not yet. 25 years that I've been in America, not yet.
You don't feel that you're up to naturalization yet?
Well, I haven't been pushed to a position where I have to do it. But if I had to, probably I would.
A more important reason for you to become so interested in nationalism could be what you've called an inverted Orientalism, that when you were in your 20s, you were in Indonesia and you had stronger sympathies for the anti-imperialist struggles of the nationalists.
Yes, I think it's something like that. I mean, at that age, I must have been, what, early 20s then. I fell in love with Indonesia. It happens to people. It was a good time to fall in love, actually. I'm sure from the point of view of people in Holland, it wasn't a good time. But if you were a young Irish person in Sukarno time, it was a very lively place.
So let's move on to nationalism. You say that nations inspire love and often profoundly self-sacrificing love. This self-sacrifice can also mean sacrificing one's life. I mean, nationalists are willing to die for their nation. And I really want to try to understand this emotion, because I don't think that I myself would be prepared to die for any nation. But would you compare it with the self-sacrificing love of the father and the mother, the protecting the own family, of defending the own children? Would it be such a strong emotion?
That's so personalized, it's hard to compare. I mean, there's a real existing people, your children, who, you know, if you would do anything rather than have harm come to them, but they're real people. The very strange thing about the nation is that it really is imagined, and you don't know who those people are, for whom you're sacrificing. And many of the people are long dead, and some of the people you sacrifice don't exist yet. Children not yet born, grandchildren not yet born. It's an enormous, extraordinary fantasy in a way. And what's interesting is why this fantasy has such enormous
impact. I mean, you could also say that, for instance, this. I mean, let's put it this way: would you say that nationalism was misused in the past, which has led to these horrible wars and killings of the last 2 centuries?
Yes, of course it can be misused, but the basic feeling I don't think is a bad one. And to give you an example, if you go to the Vietnam Memorial, I don't know if you've ever seen it in Washington.
No, I haven't.
It's very beautiful, it's very simple. It's just this black marble, long black marble thing lying on the ground with all the names of the people. And you stand there, even if I'm not American, but I've lived long enough and I was in that time there in America, you look at it and you start to cry. It's almost impossible to stop the tears coming down your face. And it's that kind of, there are certain national songs that have the same effect. And I think here it's something to do with the way in which nationalism is connected to, there's a very strong sort of association with death, actually.
Right.
And therefore also with some kind of dream of immortality. So what people are moved by is the sense of people who sacrificed before you.
Right.
People who've died in perhaps sometimes terrible ways, perhaps not.
But one similarity between religion and nationalism would be that it's very easy to join in. I mean, it takes a simple ritual for religion, and it takes a simple ceremony of naturalization to become a member of the nation. But religions never really say that they are full, while nations do sometimes.
Well, I think there it's a complication because there's a difference between, I think, nationalism and ethnicity. And one of the worrying things that's going on now is that in the old European nations, which I think were historically not that closed, there is this growing feeling that English is something in the blood rather than in the culture. So that you can have, people I know who are young blacks who were born in England, who pay taxes in England, speak English, know English literature, have lived all their lives in England, will die in England. Still, in the minds of some English people, you can't be English unless you're white.
You wouldn't call them nationalists?
No. I think most of them are racist, and if they're not racist, then they're people who've retreated to a kind of ethnic identity rather than a national one.
To go back to imagined communities, the word imagined, do you use it in a sense of an invention or in a sense of something symbolic like the flag, the national anthem?
No, it's in English. I'm not sure how it would work in Dutch, but in English I picked it very carefully. If you say imaginary, it means invented. It means
and not real.
It's like a unicorn or something like this, something that we know clearly isn't the case. And it's purely symbolic in that sense. The importance of imagined, I think, is that it's both true, or it's both real and fictional at the same time. So that you can think about, say, the Dutch nation, and you can't touch the Dutch nation. You don't know where it ends. You don't know where it begins. But it seems very real to people. And it's so real, it's not symbolic, it's actually understood to be real. There really is a Dutch nation out there. But on the other hand, the only way you can approach it is through the imagination.
But then we get in trouble when we look at the word community, because the word community suggests a kind of horizontal comradeship, as you said. But that is really imaginary. I mean, that kind of equality never exists.
Well, on many levels it doesn't exist, but there is a level at which it does exist, actually. And you can see that actually very often in, the best example I can give you is the medals that are given for people who are killed in war, that these medals are never given for killing the enemy, successful killing of lots of enemies. They're always given for sacrifice. And the purpose of the who sacrifices for who, you'll find very often it works against the standard social structure of the society. That is, very often a higher person, socially more advantaged person, who actually will lay down their life for somebody who is beneath them. So I think that the symbolism of this is, if you look at the tombs, for example, that have been laid out in North France, Belgium, of the First World War, they made a very strong point that everybody's grave would be the same.
Would be equal.
Equal,
so
yes.
When they are dead, they are equal, of course.
Well, of course they're equal. And that's part of, I mean, behind nationalism, there is always the dead, and the dead are always, in some sense, equal.
Let's go into the history of nationalism, and way back to the 18th century. You said that this sense of nationness started or originated from the Americas, especially South America. And this had to do with two factors: the self-awareness of the American-born whites and with the rise of mass communication. Let's start with this self-awareness. How did this self-awareness of the Europeans who were born in America come about?
Well, they were in this strange position, I think, of being told that they were Europeans, but having never seen Europe. And in those days, the travel to the Americas, north and south, was, of course, difficult, arduous, and long. And when people started to be born there and grow up there, in that landscape, in those places, very naturally they got attached to them. And also, when people came from England or from Spain to the Americas, they quickly adopted a kind of attitude to these people: well, there's something wrong with you. You can't be really English, or you can't be really Spanish, as it were, because you're born in a strange place and you eat this rather strange foods and so forth and so forth. So these words like Americano was used by the Spaniards to, as it were, look down on.
They were treated as inferiors.
Treated as inferiors. The British looked at the settlers as colonials. You can still see it today if you go to London and hear British people talking about Australians or New Zealanders. I mean, there's something wrong with them because they are not
because
born
they were not
there.
born on English soil.
But it's more than that, as you know. The policy of the imperial rulers, they didn't trust these people. They never permitted them to have the top bureaucratic jobs, even though they were technically Europeans. They always sent out people from Europe to run these colonies. So they were in a very peculiar position of being both told you are European and at the same time told you're not European. And that created, I think, a kind of sense of separation or a sense of alienation. And I think in many ways nationalism has its roots in a sense of a certain kind of loss.
Another precondition for modern nationalism, you say, is the development of the newspaper, and this is a very important but also very abstract issue in your theory. One aspect is clear, that reading the newspaper is like a mass ceremony, because people have this common experience of reading the same paper at the same time. But the other aspect of this simultaneousness is about this common perspective you talk about, which I don't understand. Can you help us with that?
Well, if you think about newspapers, one of the very strange things about them is that they tell you all these extraordinary pieces of information which are not connected to each other. A football match, a coup d'etat, a famine, an earthquake in all kinds of different places. And day after day you see this jumble of different stories which are only connected by one thing, which is the date at the top of the newspaper. And this comes out day after day after day. What it does is to create a kind of conception of time which didn't exist before anywhere in the world, in which people are accustomed to the idea that lots of things are going on simultaneously. And it's this, then from this comes the practice of writing novels, which are very much tied up with the origin of nationalism. If you look at the classical novels we're familiar with, they also are a new literary form in the sense that they assume that lots of things are going on at the same time between people who don't know each other or may not be connected. And this is really, if you like, the grammar in which nationalism thinks. It thinks about lots of people doing things simultaneously.
So in the case of the novel, I understand that the reader, the writer deliberately creates a position for the reader so that the reader knows more in the novel than the characters know themselves. But in the case of the newspaper, those events are scattered, they happen independently of each other. So why wouldn't the linkage between all those events be logically, well, this all happens in the world I live in? Why wouldn't it give us an idea of an interconnected global community instead of a nation?
The reason is, of course, the language in which the newspaper is printed. One of the great transformations that printing did or created for the modern world was really two things. One is it got rid of the hundreds and hundreds of different small dialects which people actually spoke. Take even Holland, dozens of different ways people actually speak Dutch.
Right.
But it can all be aggregated as printed Dutch. But there are not many dialects outside the Netherlands which can be aggregated into Dutch. Maybe Plattdeutsch could be conceivably. But all over the world, you're seeing lots and lots of different ways people speak being homogenized at the level of the national printed language. So this creates a kind of much larger universe than any of the oral communities that had previously existed. That's the first thing. The second thing, however, is that the print until very recently was one of the very few forms of capitalism, print capitalism, which couldn't be internationalized because everybody is stuck in some sense with the language of their mothers or the language of their fathers. You may learn other languages in the course of your life, but you never have it in the same way as you have your mother's, and you're stuck with that. So there's the possibility of having a kind of international language or global language through which global events could be seen. It's going to be a long time before we see that. So the typical newspaper was one where you saw the world
through the language you spoke.
Through the language that you read.
Because that's what you said about the development of European nationalism in the 19th century. You said that the precondition for this was that there was a very important development in the local languages, in the production, more concretely in the production of dictionaries and grammars. Can you explain that? Why was that so important?
Well, I think it was because for a long time in Europe there were sort of high languages. Initially Latin, of course, was the European language, and then after that there were sort of still high languages, and French was the most obvious example, German in another way, English much less so, whereby people who thought of themselves as highly educated people wouldn't speak local languages because they thought this was what you spoke to the maids. I remember reading in the 18th century, for example, I mean, upper class Dutch people spoke French, and we know that in Tsarist Russia, I mean, people didn't speak Russian except to the servants. So there had to be a kind of shift in the status of these languages so that the language, as it were, of the peasants, the languages of ordinary people, had to assume a new kind of political value. And we can see that in the research that was done by young Czech intellectuals, young Hungarian intellectuals, and so forth in the 19th century when they, as it were, went to the people, as they called it, and started to write these dictionaries. I mean, these languages had been there for centuries, but nobody had thought that they were valuable enough to make a dictionary of, let alone to create grammars for them.
Would you suggest that these languages really came into existence after the dictionaries were written, although the languages were being spoken for many hundreds of years?
Well, I think that's right in a way. I think what happens is that when you get, for example, a standard Dutch dictionary, then a kind of new language has emerged. It's a kind of composite reading Dutch. And in that sense it's novel, that somebody has to put together. I mean, a dictionary is a strange book because it's a book that none of us has ever read from cover to cover. There are many words in those dictionaries, even the most educated of us don't understand. So it stands in some way for something that none of us actually has. It's the whole language. And it's also, of course, standardized so that you can only write these words in one way. And in that sense, I think it's a very interesting, novel form which helps to show people there really is a language there. It's got its own shape. It can be bounded in with the covers of a single book. That's it. And when you then have the dictionaries, the Dutch-German dictionary or the French-English dictionary, the dictionary says the two languages are equal. So what the dictionary does in many ways is to equalize languages and bring French and English, the high languages, down to the level of everybody else. There's a kind of extraordinary equalization of languages that is taking place in the 19th century.
And it started with language, this European nationalism. But how did it develop into this bloed und boden kind of nationalism in the 20th century?
The question is, where does the idea of the bodem come from? And here I think the absolutely crucial thing is the mass production of maps. These peculiar kind of maps that Europe invented, essentially, where you can, as it were, look at a country from God's point of view, from the sky. And it's got a clear border running around it, and it's got a shape. I mean, you can, I've done this experiment, and I'm sure you've done this too, to show you what the map really is, which is to draw an outline of a country that young people are familiar with. In this case, it might be Netherlands, in America. And you don't put anything on the map at all. No names, no rivers, no nothing. Just
the shape.
Just the shape. And you ask them, do you know what this is? Of course they know what it is. There's nothing on the map at all to show you.
They recognize it immediately as this is the Netherlands.
Yes, I bet you that was what you'd find if you did this. People would recognize it once, because it's everywhere. It's in restaurants, in hotels, it's in travel guides, it's in all kinds of things, in schoolrooms. And this sense of that's what our bodem is, that's what we have to defend, is a product of this peculiar kind of imagining which a certain kind of technology of knowledge really made possible. I'll give you a very nice example. The United States acquired Alaska by buying it from Tsarist Russia in 1867. American students know this perfectly well. But if you say to them, and I've tried this many times, is to say, well, you have very severe, what you call it, foreign exchange problems now. There's a huge debt to Japan. Wouldn't it be much simpler, really, to solve the problem by selling Alaska to the Japanese? And the reaction is always absolutely dumbfounded. People's mouths open. It's inconceivable. Even though they know it's been bought.
Right.
Inconceivable to sell it. It's become holy soil.
It became part of the bodem.
It became part of the bodem, yeah. So none of them have been to Alaska.
And this making it a part of the bodem, and this production of these maps and formulating the area, it has something very official to it. You mentioned the difference between popular nationalism and official nationalism. What would that difference be exactly?
Well, I think you have to remember here that the important states of Europe, and in fact most of the world, up until the beginning of the 19th century, were essentially what we would today call multi-ethnic and very often multi-religious. Empires were accumulated by wars, by dynastic marriages of all kinds. So these huge things like Russia, as it used to be, or Austria-Hungary, or the Ottoman Empire, even United Kingdom of Ireland and England, these were all supranational or pre-national states. And so that when the nationalist movements began, they were typically outside the state, hostile to the state.
Intellectuals, capitalists in the 19th century.
Yes, and there are popular movements designed to break up these antique monsters, as it were. Now, in many cases, or in some cases, where people who were at the top of these multinational empires saw what was coming and saw the danger of this popular movement towards them, they tried in some ways to, they were threatened by it, they tried then to co-opt it in some way, take it over, so that you get at the end of the 19th century the Tsar starting to Russify, which they'd never done in hundreds of years, because they see what's coming, which is that if they don't Russify, very quickly they're going to be regarded as not Russian.
So that's where nationalism became a policy.
Yes, it's a policy of threatened traditional upper classes. And even here it's very interesting that the British monarchy had to change its name in World War I. It only started calling itself by an English name, Windsor, in 1917 by a special proclamation. Queen Victoria wasn't a Windsor, she was still a German family. So you can see even in England the pressure to naturalize oneself on the part of these monarchies.
So the English queen was naturalized in...
Well, it was the English king, in fact. It was George V in 1917, quite striking. And the famous Mountbatten, of course, that family is not, was changed at the same time. It was Battenberg. And of course they were embarrassed, worried about this, and so they had to show they were really English, but very late.
And one other important policy of this official nationalism was it was the introduction of compulsory state-controlled primary education, not only in the European nation but in the whole empire. And then here we come to the colonies, because one thing you mentioned about the Indonesian case, to go to that subject, is that the Dutch school system created a schooled youth. And that this was the first generation of nationalists. How did that transformation happen, actually?
Well, the Dutch did something which seemed to them quite natural, but actually was very strange. They built a kind of rationalized and centralized school system, so that all over the colony, kids in primary school, if they got to primary school, all read the same textbooks and learned the same grammar. And then if they were successful and moved on to high school, the same thing was happening, absolutely standardized format for schoolrooms, classrooms, textbooks and so forth, all over the colony, but not outside the colony. And finally reaching up to the highest levels when you have the beginnings of these faculties of law and so forth. So for the first time, this vast place with all the different cultures and languages had a system of standardized mass communication, which was bounded by the colony itself. It didn't go into Malaya, it didn't go into the Philippines, but it went all over the colony.
And all these students, they met each other at the top of the schooling
Well, they're
system.
meeting each other at different levels. I mean, the primary school kids come from different villages. Probably they wouldn't know each other beforehand, but you put them in the primary school, there they meet. Kids go on to the high school, which comes from a much wider a sphere of people. People are meeting people who, under other circumstances, they would never have met. Ethnic groups meet in the same classrooms, under the same teachers. Very soon they start to marry each other in a way that would have been inconceivable early on. And there's a kind of logical apex to this, which is the capital of the colony, Batavia.
Yeah.
That's where, if you make it, you will end up, but probably no further. So that, in a sense, what the educational system does is to mimic the form of the colony, but rather than actually seeing it out there, you experience it. The journeys that you make from that small little village in West Java to the high school in the provincial capital, up to this, where you know there's so many other people making the same journey. And you ask yourself, well, what is it that we're all here together for? What is the purpose of this? It creates the idea that this is a real place. The Netherlands, Indies exists
as a community. So all these students coming together in Batavia.
Well, there's only a small number that get that far,
yes.
But lots of people see themselves headed in that direction.
But that's where they really realize the size of their community and the
No,
impact.
they already get the size of the community from the geography textbook that tells them this is
of course,
Netherlands.
yes, the maps and all that.
They know where everybody's coming from, but it's concretely realized in human terms by the actual journeys these little kids make.
But this transformation from the native to the nationalist, I mean, you mentioned that the Dutch language really gave good reason for that transformation by using the word inlander.
Yes, I mean, this is a strange business. It's not just peculiar to Dutch, but by having a kind of the way the Dutch classified people, it says, well, there's obviously the Dutch, there's vreemde Oosterlingen, and then there's inlanders.
Which would be the vreemde Oosterlingen would be the Chinese and the
Arabs.
And the Arabs.
Indians. They came from somewhere else. But inlanders mean, of course, that you belong there. And the fact is, from the Dutch point of view, it didn't matter whether you were Sundanese or Muslim or Christian or from New Guinea or whatever it was, you were all the same. You were inlanders. And this has a powerful impact too. That is, and persuades people in the long run that in some way they really are the same. And if you're inlander, you belong there, you were a native.
And the Dutch didn't.
And the Dutch are not natives.
Yes.
And therefore, in a sense, the logic of the Dutch expression itself tells...
Excluded themselves from Indonesia.
That's right. Yes.
But you also said that the Dutch never really tried to promote the Dutch language in Indonesia itself, because they found it more convenient to let the Dutch functionaries learn the lingua franca of Indonesia, which was called Dienst Malays, than to teach the Indonesians Dutch. But was this done out of convenience, or Was this done out of the lack of having a strong civilizing mission in comparison to the British and the French?
No, I think that if the Dutch, I mean, this is something I would like to, I have no idea what the situation is, for example, in Suriname. But in the Indies, you have to remember that for 200 years, the Indies was ruled by a business, not by a national government. And this business didn't want to spend any money or waste any money on creating Dutch as the language of its empire. They took the easy way out, which was a clever way out, which was to use a simple local lingua franca as the language of administration. This is the only colony in the world that I know of which is ruled primarily through
the language,
a non-European language. I mean, it shows you how odd this is. But the reason is because of the VOC. So it's a very old colony as well. Now, when Holland in the 19th century took over the Indies as a real colony, it was an extremely poor country. Holland was extremely backward, really up until the end of the 19th century in European terms. The life expectancy of an Amsterdammer and a native in Batavia in 1860 was about the same. Railways came to the Holland only about 15 years after they came to Java. So Holland really wasn't in a position, even if it wanted to spend the money that would have been necessary to, so late in the game, to make Dutch genuinely imperial language in the Indies, which was a huge place by the 19th century. It was just too late. They did do a bit in the beginning of the 20th century. There are Dutch language schools and so forth. By that time, you had 2 centuries or more of widespread use of Malay or Indonesian. It's a very strange and peculiar story.
That makes this group of nationalists very small in Indonesia. So it was quite amazing that this new intelligentsia developing there in Indonesia, speaking and writing Dutch, and using sophisticated Western ideas of the French Revolution and American Revolution, weren't they very isolated from their own people? I mean, the question is, was this nationalistic movement of Indonesia a truly popular movement?
Well, I think it was popular in the sense that you had from the end of the 19th century already Malay language newspapers and the rise of the vernacular press. I mean, if this elite had been, there had been no Malay, and this was simply a Dutch-speaking elite, which happens in other colonies, I think it would have been a very thin stratum with not much connection to the mass. But here you have starting 30 years or so before formal nationalism begins, you already have this vernacular press, which is easy to read. It's a language that people use in the marketplace and so forth. So I think that the social base for this...
But were the people in the market able to read the newspapers?
Increasingly, yes. I mean, literacy is slowly rising. It's rising especially in urban centers, of course. But I think this is the first ground. And then, of course, the second big ground came with, already in the 30s, with the growth of radio, which allowed people to speak to illiterates on a mass level. And then during the Japanese occupation, one of the things the Japanese did very significantly was to spread the use of small receivers all over the western part of Indonesia. And this was very novel, and there was even a special word for it the villagers created, which was singing trees. That's what they called these poles, on which the Japanese put small amplifiers. And then it was possible for the first time for Sukarno actually to talk to hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people who actually couldn't yet read. And he talked to them in the language of we, us. Our struggle, our past, our future, and so forth. And it had an enormous impact.
You mentioned that to go back to the Dutch colonialism, that they were not very interested in education of the Indonesian people. They were racist rulers. They were conservative. But still, we have a figure like Multatuli, who had a great influence on the first generation of nationalists in Indonesia. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think that you find, in fact, in all the imperial systems, I mean, Multatuli is an astonishing example, one of my favorite people, but there always are people like that.
And he's quite unique if you look at the situation in India or elsewhere. that Multatuli was a real, very special figure in colonialism.
For an official, I mean, what's interesting about Multatuli was he was, of course, actually an official rather than a visitor. And for him to turn on the system in the way that he did was very remarkable. And he happened to be a fantastic stylist. But if you look at Max Havelaar, if you ask Indonesians today about Max Havelaar, they have a completely strange idea about that book. They think it's a book about Seija and Adinda, which is a tiny part of it. And the fantastic part has nothing to do with that. The fantastic part is actually the first part, which is set with Droogstoppel, you know, here in the Netherlands. It's a very nationalist book in its own way too, you know. But that's wiped out in the Indonesian memory of it.
So they read it as an Indonesian book, and they just neglect that part which starts the perspective of Holland itself.
That's right, yes. Mm-hmm.
You have studied Indonesia for about 30 years now, and you haven't been to Indonesia for the last 20 years. Can you explain
22.
why? 22 years. Can you explain why?
Why what?
Why you didn't visit Indonesia for the last 22 years? What happened?
Well, I'm banned. I can't go.
And why was that?
Well, there's two reasons, I think. The first reason was that after the coup d'etat, or attempted coup d'etat of 1965, along with a colleague of mine, two colleagues of mine, we wrote a preliminary analysis of what had happened on October the 1st,
the coup against Sukarno, the first one, 65.
Well, that, yes, and the massacres that then followed. And this coup basically said that the origins of the coup were conflicts inside the military, rather than, as the military said, it was plotted by the communists, which then justified the extermination of the Communist Party and the massacres of hundreds of thousands of people. So it became an extremely controversial document, even though it was called preliminary. And when
it's now known as the Cornell paper.
Yes, but in fact its original title is Preliminary Analysis. It was done, what, 2.5 months after the coup. It was very preliminary. And for a while the military authorities tried to persuade me and my colleagues that we were wrong, that the army's version was true, but that was very difficult to accept. So they got tired of this, and in 1972 I was actually kicked out of the country.
Because what you actually did was proving that the killings of all those hundreds and thousands of communists had no reason at all, had no real reason.
Well, it had a reason, well, plenty of reasons, but
not the reason they gave.
Well, not justified reason. So that it was regarded as quite dangerous for the government.
Because you attacked the legitimacy of Suharto's...
Well, it wasn't intended that way, but that's in fact the consequence of it. So when they finally kicked me out for good in 1972, then I think possibly after many years had passed it would have been all right. They would probably have said, well, it's all gone by. But it comes back, and it's coming back now again. This is an issue that's never finally settled. But in 1976-77, I was summoned to testify before the United States Congress on several occasions about political prisoners, and later about East Timor, and testified before the United Nations. I broadcast and many things like this. So they think that this is another wicked thing that I've been doing. So in their eyes, I'm a kind of beast, in a way, who are always making some kind of bad trouble. So it's understandable, I think, that they...
But the thing is that Suharto seems to have forgiven, the irony, that Suharto has forgiven the Dutch their colonialism. If you look at the warm relationship between the Dutch government and the Indonesian government these days. But he hasn't forgiven you.
Well, I don't think the Dutch have any intention of making trouble for Suharto, right?
What do you think about this relationship between the ex-colonizers and the ex-colonized?
Well, I think that from the Indonesian ruler's point of view, I mean, the people who are, except Suharto himself, of course, was a Kanil sergeant. And he was still a teenager in the late colonial period. But if you look at his cabinet, these are people who have no personal memories of Dutch rule. he's the only one in the government who has this memory. So for them, I think it's not a big problem. After all, the Dutch gave them lots of aid over the years, have been quite helpful in many ways. No reason not to have a good relationship with. And a lot of people still have, upper class Indonesians still have sort of memories of their mother saying, well, we had a wonderful trip in Holland, it was so nice to be able to use Dutch somewhere and so forth. I think what's more interesting is the Dutch side. I mean, I think the Dutch attitude to Indonesia is much more interesting than the Indonesian attitude.
How would that be much more interesting?
Well, it seems to me that the whole question of whether the Queen can or cannot visit Indonesia, I mean, this is now almost, it's 40 years since independence, that the Dutch still agonize over whether she should go or she shouldn't go.
But why do you think it's so important for the Dutch to have the Queen visiting Indonesia?
I don't. I just think it's interesting. What's extraordinary to me is that this should be an issue at all, that people should worry about it and argue about it, and this should not have been yet decided over 40 years. This is very remarkable. If you think, for example, about the case of Ponka Prinsen, here's a man who decided to become an Indonesian, fight against the Dutch in the independence war. It's absolutely astonishing that for 40 years he's not been allowed to come back to Holland. I mean, talking about not forgiving, it's absolutely astonishing to me. So it seems to me that there's some way in which, and then there's all these books which are about, you know, the good old times and the enormous selling value of the Indies as it used to be. I mean, how popular it is. And this shows that in some strange way Indonesia is...
It's also very critical nowadays. I mean, the literature is not only romantic.
Yes, I know, but still, I mean, the point is that there's still, it's somewhere deep down in the psyche of the Netherlands. I mean, the contrast that you can draw, I mean, India is also some way deep down in the psyche of England. And the contrast is obviously the Philippines. And the Americans have absolutely no sense that it's inside them at all. Couldn't care less about the Philippines, much sooner forget about it. But I think it's difficult for the Dutch to forget the Indies or Indonesia.
Forget their empire.
Well, I think there's all kinds of things. I mean, you look at around the city, I mean, you see the amount of restaurants, you see the names of canals or streets. I mean, the presence, or sort of invisible presence of the empire is still here.
Would you say that Indonesia is much more important now for the Dutch than the Dutch are for Indonesia?
Well, I would think so, but it depends important at what level.
Culturally speaking.
Yes, I think so.
So what is actually the importance for the Dutch? Why do they think Indonesia is so important?
Well, I mean, you would know that better than me, but...
But I wouldn't. I don't understand it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was an extraordinary thing, this tiny little place on the edge of the North Sea, which you can bicycle across, what, in one day?
Well, yes, it will take a while, yes, but you can,
I think you can do it in a day. You know, held this vast, I mean, it is, geographically, it's one of the largest countries in the world. It's the fourth largest in population and so forth. I mean, it is an absolutely astonishing fact that right up until 50 years ago, this situation, there's lots of reasons to feel
that they lost something there.
Well, there was something big there. And you always hear Dutch people talking about Ons Klein, what is it, Ons Klein Holland? You know, in no other country, and it always tells you how small they are right away.
Well, they realize that they are very, very small.
Well, I think so, but it may be tactical. That is, once you say small, then you can also say what good things we did. I mean, the smallness may then make what you do all the bigger. And it was rather an astonishing thing. I mean, we have to give them credit.
One last personal question. Which country would you be prepared to die for? Is it such a difficult question?
Yes, because I think that for someone with, as it were, many nations inside them, it would depend on, very much on the circumstances.
So you're not sure yet?
Well, put it this way, I mean, if I was called up for the Gulf War, I would be on the first plane to Canada. I mean, no way. I mean...
You would run?
Yes, I would run. If... I'm not sure, I can't give you the answer to that, I just simply don't know. And probably one doesn't know until the time comes.
Mr. Benedict Anderson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under starry skies. Don't fence me in. Let me ride through the wide country that I love. Don't fence me in.